Hi, I'm Newsday's engagement editor, Elaine Pena, and I'm here with editorial cartoonist Matt Davies, who was named Pulitzer Prize finalist on Monday.
Hi, Elaine. Hi, everybody. Hi, Facebook.
So why don't you tell me about the work that you were honored for? It's my understanding that 20 cartoons are submitted.
Yes.
So why don't you walk us through that process and tell us about your work?
That's correct. The Pulitzers are conferred upon a portfolio of maximum of 20 cartoons from the prior year. So this was for cartoons drawn in 2015, and the process of picking out the cartoons is fraught and difficult, and I draw 6 cartoons a week here, and so I'm not really good. Math is not my strong suit, but it's a lot of cartoons,
Right.
And then to have to whittle it down to 20 at the end of the year, and 20 that you're going to be judged on is tricky. So the process. So I get some of my editorial colleagues, and we just put them out on the editorial board conference room table, and then you just kind of go through, and I try to get. I know which ones are my favorites, but oftentimes the ones that are near and dear to me, other people just don't really care about. Maybe there was some technique that some writing or something that I really liked, and just nobody else really gets, or they're like, no, that's not so good. So I use that process to sort of pick out, sort of weed out the cartoons that maybe don't work as well. And then somehow at the end of it, and we get it down to about 80, and then a few days later we're down to 50, and then a few days later we're down to 25, and then I have to start kicking off things that I really want to be in there. I think a writer talked about killing your darlings in the writing process. It's very similar in the editing down process for picking out a portfolio of cartoons. But that's how we get to it. But they usually, from my perspective, I try to make it so that they're cartoons that have a lot of it, that are saying something.
Right.
Humor is important in editorial cartoons to a degree, kind of a sort of dry wit, and I like, but mostly they need to be pointing out some type of irony, some injustice, something that is because they are editorial cartoons, they're opinion cartoons, they're supposed to show bias and shed light on things, based on what I think of that issue.
Right. So how long is that process, picking the cartoons that you're going to submit?
Well, it should really take, because the deadline looms every year for the
Right.
Pulitzers, and it's kind of an annual ritual, and I spend about 2 months procrastinating, and then they're due in like end of January. I think January 25th is the deadline. So right around the holidays, I start kind of going, I really should be, whittling down these cartoons, and then really, I spend about a week really just like, really concentrating on it prior. So probably about between 1 and 2 weeks is what it takes. It should take longer. It should be a more deliberative and considered process, but maybe next year I'll do that.
There's always next year.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause for a second to tell our commenters that they can ask Matt questions, and as time allows, I'll pick out questions to ask him from our followers. So you were a winner in 2004.
Mm-hmm. Yes, correct.
So tell us about that and the work that you did then and how it compares to what you do now.
Yeah, 2004, which was, as we were saying right before we went on, is 12 years ago, which is crazy to me because it feels like about 2 years. That was for the same portfolio of 20 cartoons, though at the time we were in the run-up to the Iraq War,
Okay.
and well, actually, no, I think we had actually gone to war around 2003. I'm a little hazy on that, but I had a lot of cartoons that were in opposition to the Iraq War and were very critical of the Bush administration,
Mm-hmm.
the Bush-Cheney administration, and that's what I won for. I mean, there was a few other cartoons with other issues in there, but I feel like that was sort of the anchor of the time was that issue, and that's what I primarily focused on. And it was funny enough, the finalists for that, because in the Pulitzers they pick, there's a lot of entries, and then the judges pick 3 finalists, and this is in every category, and then those 3 finalists go up to the board, the Pulitzer board, and they wear like big hats and epaulets and stuff, I guess. I don't know. And they decide who actually wins, and then who are the runners up. And the year that I won, Gary Trudeau and Steve Sack, everybody's heard of Gary Trudeau and Steve Sack, who's at the Minneapolis Star Tribune, both brilliant in many regards. And then, which was amazing to me because like when to be people of that standing, especially this was a while ago, I was quite young, and but what's interesting is that this year I was a finalist again in 2011, and then this year as a finalist, the other finalist, the winner was Jack Arman, who has had this coming for a long time, and I'm very happy that he won it. But the other finalist was Steve Sack, who was the guy who was the finalist when I won back in 2004. So, and we had a little chit chat, about that on Facebook. Yeah, very. So it was a very. It's a very surreal process to I mean, right now we're here sitting in my lair where I draw, and I got my light box, and I got my computer and all that stuff, and I just think, I come up with my own ideas. I get feedback from my colleagues, my editorial colleagues. But it's a very lonely existence, and most of the feedback I get is, people generally don't call to say, "Hey, nice job." They generally call because they're pissed off, and so I hear a lot of negative feedback. I do hear some positive feedback, and here on Long Island, I actually have had more people call me to tell me they like my work than I've ever experienced before, which is kind of new. And it's just wonderful, nice welcome.
But Long Islanders.
I'm actually, New York. Long Islanders have this reputation for being like, brash and bright. Like the nicest people I've met so far. So, all right, Long Islanders. But so to have any kind of big recognition just feels surreal, like to be sort of pulled out from under a rock and have something as big a deal as, everybody's heard of the Pulitzer Prize, they confuse it with the Nobel Prize, which I've had people congratulate me before on winning Nobel Prize, which has a slightly higher prize, so I'd be very happy to win a Nobel Prize. They don't give one for cartooning. So just that feeling of sort of all of a sudden being sort of brought out into the light, and you're kind of squinting, and you're like, wow, it is surreal, but very pleasantly surreal. It's a dream of everybody. I think most editorial cartoonists sort of dream of what it would be like to win, and it's a remarkable feeling. But it also kind of adds pressure to do better work, because you know that people may be paying a little more attention to what you're doing. So right. I know that for me, when I won it back in 2004, I felt this incredible need to prove myself, to fulfill whatever that promise was, just to be, having to create cartoons, and when someone says, "Oh, the Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist," it doesn't really make a difference. It shouldn't. It's really all about what I produce and give to the readers. But somehow it is there, and I did feel
it's a title to live up to.
Exactly, and it is. It's good. Anytime you've got something that's forcing you to push yourself and do better work, it's always good. Ultimately, it's hard work, and I don't get to nap in the afternoons, but that's okay.
So you mentioned how in 2004 there was sort of a theme of the Bush-Cheney administration.
Yeah.
Was there a theme in the cartoons that you submitted this year?
No. Or was there? No, it was really more of an amalgamation of all the stuff that it's been, you know, the news, I don't know if you, the news cycle is so different now than it was even back in 2004. It'd be hard to pick out a theme now because there's so much big stuff happening. So in this portfolio, I dealt with racism, the Black Lives Matter movement, police violence, Donald Trump. You know, he was a fairly big story, and the terrorism, of course, the Charlie Hebdo shootings. What else? Refugees from Syria going to Europe. So yeah, tons of huge issues.
Right.
Whereas it seemed like back in 2004, you know, there were a couple of big issues, but now it feels like there's a new massive issue every week, and everybody's just, and because of social media, it all gets just chewed on so much more urgently, and everything's changing much quicker. So it's fun to be a cartoonist because there's a lot more material getting tossed across the, you know, fired across the bow, and so there's more material to respond to.
That's great. So how did you originally get into cartooning?
Well, I've always been able to draw. I've always liked to draw. I don't want to say I've always been able to draw, but I've always liked and enjoyed drawing. The actual, like, being, I always kind of dreamt about being a cartoonist, but I never initially thought I wanted to be a political cartoonist because I felt like that was like really hard work, and would be really difficult, which it is, but it's not as hard as I thought it was going to be. I first started doing political cartoons when I was, back in 1988, and it was just dabbling. I just started doing it was during the Bush. It was when Michael Dukakis was running for president, and Bush Senior, George Senior, and I just, I was young, and my political switches had been turned on, and I became sort of politicized, and it was sort of all I knew how to do was draw and write, and I just started commenting on what I was reading in the paper by doing political cartoons, and then I thought, it's pretty good, and because I was also, at the time, I was doing commercial illustration and all kinds of other stuff. I was freelance, and in art school at the same time. I was, wearing multiple hats, and I just started selling the cartoons to newspapers, freelance, and Village Voice. I was in the city at the time, Village Voice, and a bunch of other places, and so it just. And I realized that and then there was a demand, like people were going, yeah, these are good, can we get more? And so I was like, all right, I'll do this, because this seems like a really good way to make a living. And that's sort of how I sort of segued into it. And it's actually more complicated. I met an editorial cartoonist who actually, his mom and dad were my mom and dad's neighbors, and he was the cartoonist for The Economist magazine. Cal, his name is. Okay. He's probably not watching, but he's busy drawing. He's at the Baltimore Sun and at The Economist magazine, and I saw he was kind of like my mentor. But it was weird that we were like our parents were neighbors, and so we became very friendly. And he sort of nurtured me through the process of becoming a cartoonist and to get to where I am. And he was a finalist for the Pulitzer last year, which was amazing. All right, Cal.
So walk me through the process of your latest cartoon from yesterday.
Yeah, which I just happened to have pulled up here. Let's see here. What did I? Oh yeah. So I have here the New York primary winner, and I actually sketched this up on Monday night while we were watching primaries, but we held it and ran today. And it's a New York primary winner, and he's got his "I voted" button, and he's doing the victory sign. But it's actually, if you look in here, in here it says, "I
filed my party affiliation on deadline, was appropriately electorally active in the past 4 years, complied with strict party rules, and was granted the privilege of being able to say, I voted. And it's just my comment on the absurd, just there. I wrote some. And underneath I wrote like a wise ass. Like I was being sarcastic here. Under here I wrote, the cutoff for registration is arbitrarily early. It's difficult to switch parties. Bureaucratic technicalities can purge you from the rolls. It's almost as if there are some folks in New York State who are trying to manage and control voting outcomes. So yeah, that's me being sarcastic. So I couldn't put that in the cartoon, so I had to put a little blurb at the bottom. It's the New York State. I think is the only state in the union where it takes like you have to the deadline for registering with a party. Like you can't be an independent and vote in a primary. And you know, one of the things I'm realizing, you know, you look at the Constitution. And when it talks about, you know, the right to vote, it doesn't mention anything about Democrats and Republicans. That's like a modern thing that got like duct taped to the side of our democracy. And we you know, in New York, we've completely, like, the process of electing people has just been co-opted by the parties. It's a two-party system, and they want, you can't, if you're an independent, you can't vote for who you think should be in the primary. And I just think it's absurd, and the rules are just designed to keep certain people in office, some of whom have been indicted. So, you know, it's keeping the wrong people in office. So I just thought that was worthy of comment, and so that was my effort for today.
So what do you plan to work on today? Do you already have that in mind, or?
No, I have no idea. I mean, I have a little kind of little bullet point, you know, sheet of things to think about. One, for instance, sort of struck about. It's striking that, I mean, it looks like we're going to have Trump versus Hillary, and there's all this enthusiasm on the Republican side for Trump, and not on the Republican side, on the side of the supporters of Donald Trump, there's a lot of enthusiasm, no enthusiasm by the Republican Party at large. And then on the Democratic side, there's Hillary supporters who are very enthusiastic. But polling nationally, they're both deeply unpopular. They're the two most unpopular people that are going to be running for president. And I think that's worthy of some comment. I'm not quite sure what I would do with that. And the other thing too is this morning, I was talking about this before we came in, I have an inordinately long commute to get here. And it was made even more inordinately long this morning by construction and stuff. And so I was kind of thinking about maybe doing a cartoon on that, on the arrival of spring also brings delays in traffic, which, as we know, on Long Island and probably pretty much every urban area and suburban area is a problem. Traffic, we all sit in cars, one person, one car, and we get stuck. And it gets even worse in the spring because they're cleaning up all the crap from the winter.
That would really resonate with Long Island.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, every so often I toss out a traffic cartoon because it's actually a huge infrastructure. Is a huge. It's not just an annoyance. Like it's easy to like edit it. Like I don't want to do cartoons that are just funny about traffic. It's a huge infrastructure problem, and the funding in order to fix it, the fact that we don't have a proper public transportation system, you know, this close to New York City, and you can't get in and out of New York City without being stuck in traffic, is medieval. It's so antiquated, and those are the issues that I'd like to draw about, because those do resonate with our and that was one of the things that Trump said the other day that was actually that I actually agreed with, so I'll go on record agreeing with this, when he said he was on Staten Island and he talked about the Long Island Railroad being just horrible and antique and falling apart, and I'm like, yes yes it is, and someone needs, all it needs is a little bit of money. And that's and another issue that I like to talk about is whenever anything needs to be done. The first thing that everybody says is, well, who's going to pay for it? And that's, I think that's a mistake. I think you do stuff and then you figure out how to pay for it, like bridges and things that are for the greater good. You should just do it, you know. Just, I don't know. But anyway, so those are issues that are always on my mind,
Right.
and I have those as a list of things that I'm thinking about right now to maybe come up with. But yeah, I mean, you know, what is it? It's 12:30, so by about 2 I should have something sketched out and ready to show my editor, the editorial page editor, who I bring my sketches to. Usually I have like 1, 2, 3, 4
Right.
sketches, and then I show them to her, and then we kind of, she usually likes 1 or 2, or you know, and says, well, let's go with this one, or maybe we'll do this one tomorrow, and so that's, you know, that'll be my process today.
Okay. So what kind of material do you use to sketch?
Okay, pencil, eraser on the end, very important. And I also use, I also use a black magic ink and a medieval style crow quill. It's an actual metal crow quill, and I just love the way these work. Like, so that's how I do all that's how my inking gets done with that. And then I color with watercolors, and then I scan my finished art into Photoshop, and then I correct any mistakes I've made. I straighten things up. Anything that got sloppy in the art, I fix in Photoshop and turn it into a digital image, which gets sent off to the editors. It gets paginated, goes in print paper, and then the digital version goes up online.
Yep.
So,
How do you develop your ideas, and how reliant are you on your own opinions versus the editorial boards?
how do I develop my ideas? I just think. I just sit and stare out the window and free associate, and you know, I mean, I read a lot, obviously. I do not adhere to editorial board opinions. That said, not consciously. You know, I don't kind of sit in editorial board meetings and get my marching orders and then go off and draw a cartoon about it. Sometimes my opinions differ slightly with the editorial board. But that said, you know, when I was hired here originally, it was because of, I had a, you know, decade and a half of work that they looked at, so they could see where I was coming from, so they could see that we're like really compatible from a political standpoint, but hopefully not too predictable. Well, I know that Newsday is, and Newsday opinion definitely isn't. They can go right, left, moderate. But anyway, and I come up with my ideas just from, it's what I think. I mean, I've said this before when I speak. It's really like writing a letter to the editor or writing a comment, you know, on a website. It's just something that's annoying me. Like I was talking to before we went on about how annoyed I was that it took me 2.5 hours to get into work, and the reason why it took me 2.5 hours to get into work was because of the traffic. That's a genuine annoyance, and so I write down, you know, I write something down, and then I see if I can come up with some type of image that reflects my annoyance. And it's just like writing a letter to the editor, where something you've seen it in the paper, or you've experienced it, and you go, God damn it, I gotta write this down, and I'm gonna tell them or him or her or whatever they need to hear from me. And that's really all I'm doing, is I'm just telling, people are just hearing from me about what I think. And which surprises some people. And another thing I hear a lot when I'm doing public, because I speak to groups from time to time, and I'll almost always get someone who says, hey, how come you're so biased? And I'm like, okay, there's 2 parts of the paper. There's like the news side, and they're not supposed to be biased, and then there's the opinion side, who are supposed to be biased. It is an opinion. It's an opinion, and therefore it is biased. And usually, actually, although there's a difference, usually if somebody agrees with it, they call it an opinion, and if they disagree with it, they call it biased. So a lot of, I'll shut up about that, about who finds me biased. People who watch Fox News find me biased, which I find amusing.
So what do you think goes into a good editorial cartoon? What makes a good editorial cartoon?
I think a good editorial cartoon is one that is artistically precise and not too complicated, and you know, and that's a taste thing, because I have friends who draw cartoons who do lots of words, and some of my alternative compadres, and I love that too. The you know, and they use sort of dry irony and sarcasm, and that has its place, and I enjoy it. And my personal preference is to be as simple as possible and to deliver as much as possible in as simple an image with as simple the fewer words the better. And so sometimes I get into metaphor, which I try not to be too. I try to use metaphors that are not obvious, so that there's a surprise element, and I find that to be important in a cartoon as well. And mostly, but what I really want is to have it deliver a message, something that is unexpected, or something that but something. So I like to try to go sort of flip an issue over and go, well, what about this? This is how I see it, and hopefully maybe make the reader go, oh, I didn't even think of that.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could sort of know that was working to that effect, I would feel that was a successful cartoon. So that's what I set out to do. You know, poke holes in ideas, other people's ideas that I disagree with, and sometimes politicians who I disagree with too, and their ideas. But mostly it's their ideas. I don't feel ill will towards anybody. It's just I go after ideas.
Mm-hmm. How does the process change in a breaking news situation?
Breaking news is tricky because, as you know, always breaking news is filled with inaccuracies, and we don't usually know what's happening, except the event itself, as opposed to the details behind it. So it's tricky. The cartoon I did, and this was true of a lot of cartoonists, when the Charlie Hebdo thing was happening, we were talking about something that was unfolding, and the response was shock and disgust, and so coming from a slightly different place, I think. So yeah, I mean, but you know, just like anything, we're talking about. You know, one day the job is going to be this, and then the next day it's going to be that, and then breaking news can change. I could be working on a cartoon about a subject, and then some breaking news will come in that changes. I got to pitch it and start again. You know, so it's a very organic process, and it's happening. You know, I'm always drawing today for tomorrow. So, you know, I have, you know, as the window closes on my deadline, you know, it becomes harder and harder to deal with breaking news. But I you know. It is different, but every day is different. Every subject requires a slightly different process. So whether it's breaking or sitting there in the paper for 3 days, you know.
How does illustrating this election compare to past races?
It's just been a very, very, very overwhelmingly well covered, and is. I mean, every 4 years when we get into the presidential elections, it's sort of like, for the editorial side, for an editorial cartoonist, it's like harvest time, you know, like there's so much stuff to just go and, you know, you're just commenting on there's so much stuff to comment on. But this year in particular, with Trump and Bernie Sanders and, the end of the Obama era and what's next for America, has just really generated so much interest, and everybody's talking about the election. It makes cartooning about it more fun, because you know that people are paying attention. I can toss a cartoon out there and people will actually respond to it. So that's I haven't experienced it. You always get that uptick every 4 years, but this year it's been like nothing else. I mean, just Trump alone has been, you know.
How is the process different for the political cartoons and then what you do for the children's books?
It's the children's books are much slower. They take. I'm actually working on a children's book right now. When in the evenings, that is due. The final artwork is due in June. Well, end of May, but beginning of June. And that's just taken months and months of sketching and approval and all that other stuff. Whereas with the editorial cartoon stuff, it's like, you know, it's like here and now. But other than that, it's really not that different. It's surprisingly similar because I'm trying to convey a ton of information, and really, and I come from a position of empathy on everything, and that's just the way I am. And so in my editorial cartoons, I'm trying to teach empathy to adults, and in my children's books, I'm trying to teach empathy to children, and, which is kind of high, you know, I don't know if I ever succeed, but I certainly try anyway. Empathy for the other, I guess, that's my so. But yeah, other than that, it's just drawing and painting and having fun and enjoying myself, which is what I love about this job.
Okay. And what cartoon are you most proud of?
The most. Okay, you asked me that before this, and I can't really say which one I'm proud of the most because I have a lot of them that I like, and I have a lot that I'm less thrilled with. But this was one that was in my portfolio for the Pulitzer, and I actually really liked it because it was a challenge, and it said what I wanted to say visually, and I didn't see anybody else saying it, and it was back during in the South Carolina when they were pulling the Confederate flag when they all of a sudden it got taken down from the state capitol in the aftermath of that horrible church shooting, and everybody here was celebrating rightly that this thing was coming down. But in the Northeast here, and in many places, but certainly here on Long Island, and it's true over in Westchester, Connecticut, and all around in the whole Northeast, the tri-state area. So we've got the South, and we've got the stars and bars here, and then down here, the North, you have the fence with the white neighborhood, minority schools, minority neighborhood, and white schools, and that is just as pernicious a problem. More of a problem up here than it is down south. There's actually more racial integration down south, and I just wanted to do that. And when I was talking about before, that whole like try to flip things over and go and hold up a mirror and say, hey, this is actually whenever someone's patting themselves on the back, that's when you're going to do a cartoon that says, don't pat yourself on the back, check this out, like check yourself in the mirror. And that one worked effectively for me. And as you can tell, like I just sort of described it, and it's so much easier to just look at the cartoon and you'll get exactly where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. And I had tremendous feedback on that particular cartoon. But I just thought from a graphic perspective, I liked it, and in terms of a message, it worked for me. So,
Okay. Well, we're out of time, so unfortunately I won't be able to ask reader questions right now, but I'll sift through them and maybe I'll send some of them to you, and if you have time to answer them,
sure.
We'll reply in the comments section.
Love hearing from readers.
Thank you for your time and congratulations.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you. Yeah, no, I enjoyed myself. It was great. We'll do this again.
Yes, and if you want to take a look at some of Matt's cartoons, just go to newsday.com/Matt.